From Chicago studios, this is the Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. Assalamu alaikum, I'm Samana Siddiqui. Doctors Without Borders is calling on pharmaceutical giant Pfizer-BioNTech to immediately share vaccine technology with manufacturers on the African continent. Less than 2% of Africans are fully vaccinated against COVID-19. Dr. Manuel Martin is a policy advisor at the Nobel Peace Prize-winning humanitarian organization, Doctors Without Borders. He says it is regrettable but understandable for rich countries to limit how many doses of the COVID vaccine they export abroad. But, he added, that it is completely unacceptable for countries to refuse to share technology. Martin also says rich countries should hold off on offering third booster shots to their populations. This is because so many around the world are still waiting for their first dose of the COVID vaccine. The White House said Wednesday morning that approximately 19,000 people have been evacuated by U.S. military and coalition flights in the past 24 hours. The Pentagon said on Tuesday that there are a little bit above 5,000 people at the airport in Kabul waiting to board flights. The U.S. military has started to leave Kabul airport to meet the August 31st deadline to withdraw all American troops from Afghanistan. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, in a press briefing this afternoon, stated that 82,300 people have been safely flown out of Afghanistan. Uganda has become the first African country to host Afghan refugees. The initial group of evacuees from Afghanistan arrived in Uganda on Wednesday morning. They came aboard a private chartered flight. They were received at Entebbe International Airport by officials at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as well as U.S. Embassy staff in Uganda. Ugandan officials said last week that at the request of the United States, the country would shelter up to 2,000 people fleeing Afghanistan. Uganda is the largest refugee hosting nation in Africa. It has over 1.5 million refugees from South Sudan and Congo. Escorted by Ugandan police, the Afghan nationals on Wednesday were transported to Imperial Resort Beach Hotel, one of Entebbe's 5-star luxurious hotels. In contrast, conditions at the American Airbase in Qatar are horrible, according to U.S. officials. This base is being used as a primary processing center for Afghan refugees. Axios News reported on Tuesday that, according to an email they received from a Pentagon official, where the Afghans are housed is a living hell. In the leaked email, Central Command Supervisory Special Agent Colin Sullivan wrote, "Trash, urine, fecal matter, spilled liquids, and vomit covered the floors." He said that these human beings are in a living nightmare. Muslim communities in the United States are preparing to help arriving Afghan refugees. Dar al-Noor Mosque in Manassas, Virginia, has already received a steady stream of food and other supplies to help refugees landing in Northern Virginia. Dulles International Airport has already received more than 1,000 people fleeing Afghanistan. Most of the refugees who arrived over the weekend will be resettled outside of Virginia, but an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 of a total of 100,000 Afghan refugees are expected to settle in the state in the coming months. Volunteers of Dar al-Noor Mosque are working with the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service to provide housing assistance, interpreters, and teachers for the incoming refugees. A Taliban representative praised New Zealand after the government gave $3 million in aid to organizations assisting in the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. Abdul Qahar Balkhi from the Taliban's Cultural Commission spoke to Al Jazeera's Charlotte Bellis about New Zealand's humanitarian profile. He said New Zealand has been the first and leading country to announce humanitarian aid to the Afghan people. New Zealand Foreign Minister Nanaya Mahura announced the aid last week. She said $3 million will go to the International Committee for the Red Cross and the United Nations Refugee Agency in Afghanistan. Balkhi told Bellis that as a representative of the people of Afghanistan, he is immensely thankful to the people of New Zealand and its government for showing empathy with their fellow human beings. Taliban flags are all over Afghanistan. Saleha Farouk explores the meaning of their flag.
From pirate ships to battlefields, flags can represent many things. They essentially tell you who is in charge. So Taliban flags are all over Afghanistan now. As a guerrilla group, they did not make a big deal about it before, but now, after the negotiated departure, flags are all around. The Taliban started off 25 years ago as a movement to bring peace to Afghanistan. That is when white became a symbol of peace which they carried. They added Islam's statement of faith to the white flag. This flag has now replaced the Afghan tricolor flag above government buildings, police stations, and military facilities with its flag. These young men and kids are making a quick sale of Taliban flags. Our goal is to spread the flag of the Islamic Emirate throughout Afghanistan instead of the tricolor flag, said vendor Ahmed Shakib, who studies economics at the university. The old flag, however, has become a symbol of defiance for many. It was prominently featured in the small protests held in recent days.
U.S. Representative Elise Stefanik is being criticized for hyping the now-canceled appearance of an Islamophobic conspiracy theorist at a Republican rally in Virginia. The GOP Congressional Conference leader enthusiastically tweeted what she described as massive news. That was the appearance of Scott Presler, scheduled for today. Stefanik described him as an American patriot, but Presler is a political operative identified as a former top strategist for an anti-Muslim group. He also believes in conspiracy theories that cast doubt on the legitimacy of last year's presidential election. Presler's speaking engagement was condemned by Democrats. His appearance has now been canceled. Organizers say this is because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Soldiers tore down a Palestinian workshop in the city of Hebron in occupied West Bank on Wednesday. Israel alleges that the shop was not licensed. However, Israel rarely issues building permits to Palestinians. This is why, in a report earlier this year, Human Rights Watch and Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem called it an apartheid state. In related news, a Palestinian man has died from injuries sustained during a weekend protest against Israel. 32-year-old Osama Khaledieh died after being shot by Israeli forces, according to the AFP. Israelis bombed many sites yesterday in airstrikes on Gaza. Palestinian protests are a part of a movement demanding an end to Israel's blockade of Gaza. Israel has killed 350 Palestinians in over a year. U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris said Wednesday that the United States would find new ways to raise the pressure on Beijing. During a meeting with Vietnamese President Nguyen Tran Phuc, Harris said the U.S. would continue to challenge Beijing's bullying and excessive maritime claims in the South China Sea. Harris made the comments as she began a visit to Vietnam to stress U.S. commitment to Asia. During the Singapore leg of her regional trip on Tuesday, Harris also accused China of intimidation in the resource-rich waterway. China hit back at the accusations through its state media on Wednesday. It accused the U.S. of hypocrisy in attempting to coerce and intimidate countries in the region in its scheme to contain China. However, Vietnam has sought to forge its own path between the two superpowers. On Tuesday, just a day before Harris's visit, Prime Minister Pham Minh Chinh met the Chinese ambassador. He assured that Vietnam would not align with one country against another. In a major milestone, the U.S. House has passed a framework for the Democrats' $3.5 trillion budget plan. The party will now proceed to drafting a more comprehensive legislative proposal as they embark on a reconciliation process within the Democratic Party. The 220 to 212 vote marks an initial step toward passing the massive spending bill that will require a united Democratic front to ensure it clears the federal legislature. A group of centrist Democrats had threatened to withhold their support, which would have scuttled the measure in the House, where Democrats hold a narrow majority. But House Speaker Nancy Pelosi was able to strike an agreement between moderate and increasingly influential progressive Democrats. She agreed to bring up for a vote a separate bipartisan $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill no later than September 27th. In a sign of the uniform Republican opposition to the $3.5 trillion package, no GOP members lent their support on Tuesday. The United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, or USCIRF, today marked the 4th anniversary of the Burmese military's genocidal campaign against Rohingya Muslims. It is calling for accountability of the military junta who perpetrated the violence. On August 25, 2017, the Burmese military launched a campaign to push Rohingyas out of Burma. It was marked by burning villages, murder, rape, and torture. This forced Rohingya Muslims to seek refuge in neighboring Bangladesh. USERV Chair Nadine Maiza said in a statement that 4 years after the beginning of the genocidal campaign, Burma has entered a new period of instability in which its most vulnerable face even greater risk. The U.S. State Department, however, in its statement, once again failed to describe it as genocide, but Canada and the U.S. House of Representatives have done so. Meanwhile, the Gambia's case against Burma is pending at the International Court of Justice. However, in a provisional order, the court did describe the Burmese military's campaign as genocide. The International Institute of Islamic Thought has announced the death of one of its founders, Dr. Abdul Hamid AbuSulayman. He passed away on August 18th in Saudi Arabia's capital, Riyadh. Dr. AbuSulayman held various positions throughout his career in his service to Islam on a global scale. This included being a founding member of the Association of Muslim Social Scientists in the United States and Canada. He also served as rector of the International Islamic University in Malaysia. AbuSulayman will be remembered for his tireless work for the Islamic cause throughout his life and as one of the intellectual and activist leaders of the Ummah. Coming up next after the break is our in-depth analysis segment. So stay tuned and we'll be right back after these messages.
If I could be you, and you could be me for just 1 hour. If we could find a way to get inside each other's minds. Walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes. Well, before you abuse, criticize, and accuse. Walk a mile in my shoes.
Despite the development of a COVID-19 vaccine, millions around the world will not have access. We need a vaccine that's free and available to everyone, everywhere. It's time for a people's vaccine.
Welcome back. In one of our previous analysis segments, we discussed President Biden's Buy American plan in detail. Let's watch.
Once again, thank you very much. Today, we're very happy as well to be joined by Dr. Fadel Kaboub, who is an associate professor of economics at Denison University, as well as the president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. Dr. Fadel, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Our pleasure. Now, for our viewers to be able to understand, what does it mean when President Biden wants to increase the share of U.S.-made parts for government purchases? And what is the Buy American all about?
So the Buy American Act is something that was introduced back in the 1930s and has stayed in place since then. And it essentially mandates that a certain percentage of the content of products that the federal government, states and municipalities in the U.S. is to be made or assembled in the United States. In some specific cases, it mandates especially that the steel content, and this is why the steel industry is really one of the biggest benefactors of the Buy American Act historically, is to be made or assembled in the United States. But the recent push for kind of updating and upgrading and reinforcing this Buy American approach has really been triggered by the pandemic, by the supply chain disruptions that we've experienced in the United States and other parts of the world. But what is often also missing from the conversation is the concern in the United States about the rise of China in particular as an economic superpower, as a geopolitical rival to the United States. And as a result, when the pandemic hit, a lot of people recognize that a lot of that supply chain has been outsourced to China and other parts of the world, and that it was not benefiting the U.S. economy, the U.S. workers, and from a national security standpoint as a result of that. And the final thing I want to add here is the fact that the political tensions that we've seen in the United States over the last 5 or 6 years, since really the 2016 election cycle, especially in this part of the country, in the Midwest and the deindustrialized parts of the Midwest, and small towns that were essentially neglected by both Democrats and Republicans for decades, those communities felt like a nerve has been pinched when Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders came to Appalachia, to the deindustrialized towns of the Midwest, and said, "We recognize your pain. We know you've been neglected and thrown under the bus by previous administrations. We're not politicians in the traditional sense. We're going to do things differently." And that triggered a huge momentum of political support on the right for the narrative of Donald Trump and on the left for the narrative of Bernie Sanders. And that nerve is still raw to this day. So the Biden administration is recognizing that outsourcing jobs for decades and neglecting communities has been a huge economic mistake and a huge political mistake. And so some of the motivation behind reintroducing a lot of the manufacturing jobs back in the United States is also motivated by that social and political tension.
Thank you for that insight. You mentioned a little bit about the pandemic. You highlighted that really well. Let's get into that a little bit. This ambitious proposal coincides with increased federal spending on contracts because of the pandemic. In your opinion, how will doing this address or solve supply chain issues?
Well, the biggest component of the supply chain disruptions that we're currently experiencing in the U.S. has to do with microchips and electronics components, which have been, obviously vital for manufacturing cars and trucks and computer systems that are used in hospitals, are used in pretty much everything in manufacturing or consumer products. So not only is it part of the supply chain for consumer products, but it's also part of the supply chain for national security items, for public health security, and so on. And it's also a high-tech sector that creates relatively good-paying jobs, under the right circumstances, obviously. So there's that dual motivation of bringing those jobs in the United States, and many countries, to be honest, have recognized that they too need to build a more resilient supply chain domestically, as opposed to the global supply chain that we've seen develop over the last 30 or 40 years, to be honest, since the rise of the kind of free trade kind of WTO era. So some of that is happening in the U.S., and it's just the momentum is ripe for it because there's the need for rebuilding quite a bit of the infrastructure in the U.S., creating a more equitable economy for communities that have been neglected for a long time. Large infrastructure spending that's about to be unleashed in the United States to deal with the climate crisis, to deal with so many problems that have been shoved under the rug for a long time. So this supply chain component is just one element of this. And the last thing I want to add that many people may not have noticed in the last few months is that Congress is still divided between Republicans and Democrats in terms of what to spend on and what are the things that we agree on that we can actually vote on and move forward with. And unfortunately, it's been one of the unifying themes of in the political sphere has been opposition to the rise of China. So you would think that the United States would prioritize investing in science and technology and research and development. It's a no-brainer. It's a good thing. But apparently it's not good enough to say that we want to invest in science and technology and innovation and all of that unless you justify it by saying this will be a way to counter the rise of China in the global economy, the rise of China as a geopolitical challenger to the United States. You add the anti-China label to it, and all of a sudden everybody in Congress likes it and votes for it. So that is kind of the underlying political tone in the United States government today. And so everything that has a slight anti-China bias to it somehow makes it through Congress. And that is a dangerous rhetoric, obviously, not only to hijack the infrastructure spending, the science and technology spending and all that via this political process, but also to build this consistent bipartisan anti-China rhetoric, anti-Asian rhetoric, anti-the rest of the world rhetoric that seeps into the popular culture throughout the system. So that's a very important thing to acknowledge, to recognize, and to actually address.
That being said, I wanted to get your professional opinion on something that the Senate has recently agreed on quite historically. So, for example, many might see these changes as the beginning of improvements being made to the federal procurement process. But as part of the overall infrastructure deal, which passed through the Senate just yesterday, what do you foresee for the domestic policy agenda in the future for us?
Well, one of the things that we have to remember with the Buy American Act type of approach is that it does favor large businesses. I mentioned earlier the steel industry having been one of the biggest benefactors of the Buy American Act. Now, if you think of car manufacturers, for example, or users, consumers of steel as an input into their production, they would rather buy it from South Korea. They would rather buy it from Brazil. They would rather buy it from a European producer at a lower cost. Why? Because those producers have invested in more efficient production techniques, whereas the American steel producers for the last several decades have benefited from government subsidies and protectionist policies that kept them in business, even though the technology they used has been obsolete for decades. So the danger of using the Buy American approach at any cost is the danger of continuing to subsidize powerful, influential lobbying groups, price setters in the United States at the expense of consumers and other businesses, and at the expense of the environment. The steel industry has been exempt from the Clean Air Act for decades because their technology is not clean and their technology is obsolete. So these are things that concern me a lot when it comes to implementing these kind of pro-American big business types of initiatives without paying attention to the long-term consequences in terms of fairness, in terms of environmental costs, and kind of accumulating more and more power and influence within a small elite group of business groups in the United States. So that's something that concerns me.
And many also share that concern. For example, a lot of people are criticizing this policy decision, particularly the Chamber of Commerce, and they say that, for example, procurement officials do require more flexibility to get the right products and services, and that this policy perhaps doesn't give them that freedom. What do you think about that?
Well, I'm not going to rush to endorse the Chamber of Commerce position because they too have their own problems there. Because they're also part of the problem in terms of the global supply chain, decentralization, globalization that we've seen over the last few decades. So the example that I mentioned, if you're a car manufacturer, you want to buy the cheaper product from some other country as opposed to the subsidized, mandated product from the United States, from US manufacturer. But that doesn't mean we should allow a global race to the bottom at any cost. So this opens the door, for me at least, for a broader conversation about how we organize the global economy. I'll give you just one number just to illustrate how extractive, how abusive the international trade system, the international financial system has been for many countries, especially in the global south. If we divide the world into two units, rich countries versus poor countries, and we net out all financial transactions, including foreign direct investment, exports, interest payments, charity payments, donations, you name it, the net amount, the last numbers we have is $2 trillion moving from the poorest countries to the richest countries. Now, that's part of the extractive global economic system. Part of it is the outsourcing, part of it is brain drain, part of it is all the economic development strategies that have been implemented and enforced by the World Bank, the IMF, and US foreign policy and economic policy in the global south. So the supply chain outsourcing is a small component of that. So when we have challenges like climate change, like poverty, like socioeconomic exclusion all over the global south, and we're trying to address those without redesigning the global financial system, this extractive engine that I described here, the $2 trillion that need to be flowing in the opposite direction from rich to poor countries, then all we're doing is just tweaking the system around the edges and not really addressing anything. So that global supply system that we have right now is not going to be, massively disrupted by this Buy American Act. It's got to be a much broader conversation about how do we rebalance the global economy without throwing people under the bus, whether it's in the United States or in other countries in the global south.
And as we conclude, let's get into that a little bit about throwing people under the bus, just in terms of implications for everyday workers. How does a policy like this perhaps encourage American manufacturers and companies to hire and invest in their own futures and in their own people?
Well, that's precisely why you see this reaction from the chambers of commerce in the U.S., because they see this as their industry being squeezed and forced to hire American workers at higher cost, as opposed to buying the cheaper inputs from other parts of the world. And this is a multifaceted problem, because when you look at the cost of doing business, especially for small businesses, it's not just wages, it's the cost of health insurance that they need to pay for that's unaffordable. And that opens the conversation about the reason why we have a movement in the US for universal healthcare, so that we shift the burden of healthcare cost away from businesses and away from employees themselves. Number two, the cost of retirement in the United States, which, at least when you look at the public option, which is Social Security, that's another significant tax burden on small businesses, in particular, the FICA tax, which goes for Social Security and medical care for the elderly in the United States. If we have a much more efficient healthcare system, universal healthcare system, and retirement benefit system, and take that burden off of the table, off of the backs of small businesses, then they will be able to pay decent wages to their employees here in the U.S., and they'll be able to bring some of those jobs back in the U.S. But unless we address that at the national level, you're always going to see either opposition from small businesses in particular to bringing those jobs here and producing things at a much higher cost and forcing some of them out of business because they're not going to be able to compete, or they'll be able to produce it at a higher cost and then pass on that cost to American consumers and driving the engine of inflation and the engine of unaffordable cost of living in the United States. So you can't just tweak one item without addressing all the other pieces of the system that are connected to it. And so far, we haven't completely had that full conversation about how do we redesign the entire engine of the U.S. economy as opposed to tweaking just bits and pieces of it.
A critical discussion here today with Dr. Fadel Kaboub, who is an associate professor of economics at Denison University, as well as the president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. Dr. Fadel, thank you so much for your valuable insight today.
Thank you very much for having me on the show.
Once again, our pleasure, and back to the new studio.
Thank you. Before moving on to our next analysis, let's take a quick break. We'll be right back after these messages.
our fellow Americans.
Right now, the COVID-19 vaccines are available to millions of Americans.
And soon, they will be available to everyone.
The science is clear. These vaccines will protect you and those you love from this dangerous and deadly disease.
They could save your life.
So we urge you to get vaccinated when it's available to you.
That's the first step to ending the pandemic and moving our country forward. It's up to you.
Dad, they took over my bedroom. Come on, come on. Okay, Dad. 1, 2, 3. You saved me. Dad?
Are you okay?
I'm fine, dear.
Your hero needs you now, and AARP is here to help. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.
Welcome back. We shared news of the FDA's full approval of Pfizer's COVID vaccine. To discuss the significance of this announcement, let's go to Imam Abdul Malik Mujahid. Over to you, Imam Mujahid.
Thank you, Samana. We have with us Professor Aaron Lotus, who is an associate professor at the engineering practice at Purdue University, Indiana. He has worked with FDA for 13 years in this particular process. Welcome to Muslim Network TV.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Tell us, what does this approval mean?
Right, so it's really a different bar from what the emergency use authorization was. So for emergency use, FDA is looking at, do they think that it's likely this vaccine would be effective? And they're looking at, what are the known and the potential benefits, and what are the known and the potential risks? And do those benefits outweigh the risks of what we know at that time? So that's the bar for emergency use. For the full approval, now FDA has received additional data. They've got more extensive clinical data. They have much longer follow-up from the clinical data. And along with that, it's not just the clinical information, but what about manufacturing, the manufacturing process of the vaccine, the quality testing, things like shelf life. So there's just a lot more information that goes into that review. So FDA has taken all of that, undergone that full review process, and at this point, FDA can now come out and say they agree this vaccine is safe, it is effective for preventing COVID-19, and that's it. That's more than what they could say before.
Well, I don't know what difference it actually makes, because, when I went to take vaccine, it was common knowledge, it is safe, it is important, it's critical, it's patriotic duty, go get it. So many millions of people got it. Now, once I arrived there, after they gave me the vaccine, a whole lot of writing which says it is only provisional and this and that, lot of ifs and buts. So what practical difference this approval means?
Yeah, that's a great question, because the same as you, I hear from over the past weeks and months, I think we hear from a lot of people, this vaccine is very safe, it's very effective, but you never heard that from FDA, because that's not what FDA was reviewing. And FDA couldn't say that, and the manufacturer, Pfizer, couldn't say that. So it's an interpretation, and at this point, that's not to say FDA didn't think it was safe or effective, but that's not that bar they were looking at. It was a lower bar. So now I think we can be even more confident that based on all the information that FDA's review that's been available, and additionally, I think what took a little more time is there had to be more time to get longer term follow-up. So now these vaccines have been out, most of these patients have been followed for at least 6 months. So there's a lot more, I think we'd have more confidence, more assurance in these vaccines going ahead. And I think that may be, and we may get into this discussion more, but that may be what caused some people to be a little hesitant on being vaccinated until now.
What is the politics of it? President Trump was pushing for it. He got a big operation going to fund it, Operation Warp Speed, and things of this nature. So government is pushing for it, and the people are worried about the pandemic. So do you think it is not just the scientific and academic process of approval, but a public pleasure and the demand and the need also plays a role in this thing?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think there's maybe, unfortunately, the politics have entered into that, have started to sway people's opinion on trusting in the data, trusting in the government, trusting in what people are saying. So I think from there, what we have to do is take a step back, look at the data and look at the science that's out there. And if we don't trust what the government's saying, most of the data is available to everybody. We can look at the same papers, we can look at the same numbers, and we can see where this is coming from. It's not, it's not secret information, it's all out there. And I think that can help us, make that decision if we do have maybe a level of discomfort with what we're hearing, and try to avoid getting mired in the politics, but instead look at the science and the data and the safety behind it.
Why it is not approved for this people under 16 years? Because they are already getting the shots. So while it is, this particular thing is still not approved for them. Emergency approval, but not the full approval.
Correct. So it still just has the emergency approval for 12 to 15. So the full approval is 16 and up. And the real reason for that is that the initial clinical study only enrolled patients that were 16 years of age and older. So the clinical study in younger children, those 12 to 15, didn't start till a little bit later. So there's simply a lag time between those studies. So in order to get the additional follow-up for those patients, it's going to take a little longer. But there are plans that I've seen in some of the reports that now that it's approved, there will be a supplement to add full approval for those younger kids. So I expect we'll see that coming probably in the near term, assuming that the safety and effectiveness data continue to hold.
So what's the future about the children who are under 12?
And again, those started even later than the ones for 12 and over. So there's no emergency use authorization for those yet. I think it's just a matter of time until enough data are collected. And then certainly those need to be reviewed by FDA to ensure there's no safety concerns in younger children. There was some concern that we've seen, and there's a warning on the labeling for the approved vaccine for myocarditis and pericarditis.
What are those warnings about?
Right, so those, as you may have heard in the news, that's can be an inflammation of tissue around the heart, which it could be serious. In nearly all cases, it was not serious, but there are some where it was, and these patients need additional treatment. So what the warning for the approved vaccine is that you should be aware of this, and it specifically calls out that the risk is highest in males and those under the age of 40, and in particular for those between the ages of 12, so 12 to 17-year-old males. So the benefit, as FDA has reviewed, the benefit is still greater than the risk, but it's something that people need to be aware of. And FDA is actively working with Pfizer to continue the studies and to collect more data to evaluate, are there any long-term concerns with that?
So the warning serves what purpose? The whole world and the media, everyone is asking people to go get the vaccine. But if there's a warning on that thing, which I even don't get to touch somewhere in that box, that warning is what? To legally protect the company so nobody files a lawsuit?
So I see the purpose of that warning as really raising awareness so that if you would give the vaccine, you should be aware of this is a potential risk. So if you would have any problems that might suggest, this is happening to you or to your children, then to consult your doctor and and work with them for treatment. So it's really increasing that awareness. So when people do get that vaccine, they're looking out for particular risks that may be more common. Certainly, pain at the injection site, tiredness, fainting, those are what you might expect, but this one's a little different. So I think it's helping people be aware that this is a risk. So if you do get vaccinated, make sure you're paying attention. And if you start to have a problem, you need to do something about it. And it's also, certainly getting vaccinated is, I've been vaccinated, I'd recommend it, but it's a personal choice. You need to weigh what are the benefits, what are the risks. And it's not just the benefit of hopefully avoiding getting infected with COVID, but and the risk, there could be a risk of, well, if your kids are in school and they've been vaccinated, maybe they don't get quarantined, maybe they don't miss school that way. So there's all different risks and benefits for everyone to consider.
So what is the percentage of people who have taken the Pfizer vaccine who face those pericarditis or whatever is the name of that?
I'd have to look it up. It's a very low number. I don't quote me on that. I want to say it's somewhere in the 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000. And again, most of those are very mild. It's something you might take, take some ibuprofen to treat. There's a very small number of cases. It's very rare where you may need further treatment than that.
So now go ahead.
No, I'd say, so again, it's a very low risk, but I think it should help people. FDA is not trying to say there's no risk with this. This is what the data shows us, and they're very open in sharing that information.
Okay. Now it is already announced that in September, people can get the booster shot. Has the booster shot been studied that if somebody has, those people who are under 40, who has a small risk of the heart condition, a male under 40, if they get the booster shot, don't you think that risk will be even increased further?
So right now, the booster shot is only available under emergency use, and that's only available for certain immunocompromised individuals. So it's still not widely available to the population. And I expect, again, that that's something that needs more data. I think it's being studied. And I have no doubt that that's probably one of the key factors that FDA is reviewing to ensure that this booster shot is safe for these patients to receive before we get first emergency authorization, and then certainly before we get full approval.
What about the Moderna? Are they in the process of moving forward with full approval?
So the Moderna application is also under review by FDA currently. It's a little bit behind. I don't think it's too far behind Pfizer. The Pfizer BioNTech was submitted just a little bit earlier. So I think I would expect that's probably why we haven't seen the Moderna one, but probably in the very near future we will.
Professor Lotus, with this emergency approval and the full approval, do you see there are going to be millions of people lining up? Now it is fully approved, let me get the shot.
I would think it should certainly, I think there'll be some people that were kind of waiting on this. They were hesitant before. Maybe they weren't confident in, they still felt it was experimental, or they thought maybe it had been rushed through, or FDA had reviewed it thoroughly. And now that it has been approved, I expect there will be an increase in people that are willing to receive the vaccine.
Well, thank you so much, Professor, for your time.
Sure, thank you.
Back to you, Samana.
Thank you, Imam Mujahid. That's all from our Chicago studios tonight. Thank you for tuning in. You can find previous episodes and more on our YouTube or Facebook. For more content, keep watching Muslim Network TV or visit muslimnetwork.tv. Salam and good night.